Welcome to the HR Uprising Podcast. This podcast series explores HR hot topics and challenges through conversations with relevant experts and real-life HR, learning, and OD professionals. The HR Uprising is about learning through collaboration and evidence-based action. We want colleagues to have the confidence and skills to rise up through their organizations by delivering real, lasting business value. Now, introducing your host, chartered psychologist, experienced change agent, entrepreneur, speaker, and coach, Lucinda.
Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising Podcast. And this week, I'm delighted to be talking to Jo Irwin of i4 Training. Now, I've known Jo for many, many years, and she has a wide range of skills that we could talk about. But the one that we got talking about quite recently that I thought was worth sharing with this audience was that of interview skills. Now, before you start yawning and saying, I know all about this, she was just explaining she often coaches both interviewees and interviewers in how to be effective at interviewing, in particular competency interviewing and panel interviewing. And when you get into this subject, it's fascinating actually it's how often we don't follow best practice. And if we aren't doing that, then we're potentially going to bring on board the wrong candidates. Now, we all know how expensive it is to bring in people who are not the right fit for the job. So it stands to reason we must make sure that our interviewing process is as effective as possible. And as you know, we like to be evidence-based. There's lots of evidence out there that interviewing, certainly unstructured interviewing, is a really fallible way of recruiting people. So I was really keen to hear from Jo about what best practice is and some real tips for this. And one point I'll just make before I go further on this one is that when we were planning this podcast, we were thinking about the audience. Now, obviously, I recognise that many of the people out there listening to us are HR professionals, learning and development professionals. But I'm also aware we've got a few line managers who listen because quite a lot of the topics are quite broad. So we hoped that this might be something, if you're an HR professional about to involve your line managers in interviewing, that this could be something with a broader appeal and they might also find it of interest. So over to you, Jo, sitting over there in Ireland. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself because I don't think I could do you justice having known you for far too long. So would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?
Oh, you're very kind there, Lucinda. Yeah. So as you say, I'm Jo Irwin, and my training company, I set that up 6.5 years ago on the back of working for a large pharmaceutical company for 18 years. And I specialize in training people, coaching people, as you say, for both sides of the table. And of course, it is a two-way process, the interview recruitment process. So I do feel with my knowledge, not only about what it takes to be an effective interviewer, but literally having coached hundreds of people at this stage who are on the receiving end of interviewers sitting on panels, I have sort of collected or collated different bits of feedback and input from these various coachees about pretty much the good, the bad, and the ugly as they've experienced it. And I do think it's a really important area that both HR professionals and line managers get their heads around, really, to ensure that, as you say, the right recruiting decisions are made.
Great. So I'm really keen to hear about the good, the bad and the ugly, but I guess we should maybe save that for a little bit later in the interview. Shall we just start from the basics in terms of competency-based interviewing? Now, that's a really bandied around term. Do you want to just explain what you would expect good to look like in the case of a competency-based interview?
Yeah, my understanding is that the majority of organisations are using competency-based interviewing. And even if they're not, they are asking questions around specific criteria or specific attributes that they are looking for a particular role. The whole ethos behind competency-based interviewing is that past behaviour is a far better predictor of future behaviour. And so competency-based technique or process would be where you define as the hiring manager or as the organisation the key competencies you're looking for. So, for example, the ability to plan and manage resources, or the ability to maintain working relationships, or leadership. So you define these qualities. You then would provide a descriptor or bullet point, as I say, the behaviours that would be demonstrating that particular competency.
What you're expecting to see. Is that
what you're expected to hear. And the more specific it is, the better.
Yeah.
And then within the interview, you are exploring or looking for evidence by asking candidates for past examples of when they have displayed that particular competency, say, for example, leadership. So rather than a candidate being able to sort of postulate or theorize what they might do if they were asked to lead a team. You're asking them, and it's almost like an instruction. Can you describe an instance when you showed leadership? Or could you describe a particular project where you had the responsibility to make decisions? Or it's actually asking people for past examples. I do think, as you rightly say, the level of confidence and competence of some people who are asked to sit on panels in this whole area is poor. And obviously, the quality of the interviewers is directly going to affect the quality of the interview process and the experience for the candidate.
So, I mean, essentially, you're saying you would want to make sure if it's a panel interview that clearly everybody on that panel understands the specific competencies that they're looking for and understands how to ask a competency-based question. So, yes, in your example, can you give me an example when you demonstrated this? But also the notes or the preparation is such that they would all recognise a good answer in the same way.
Yeah, and it really does come back to that, the specificity of the descriptor. So somebody's take on what good might look like for example, teamwork might be very different depending on where you're sitting. And so the specificity or the accuracy of the descriptor, I think, is a really important point. Now, there are, as I say, the pros of competency-based interviewing, in my opinion, would be this idea that past behaviour is a better predictor. And if a candidate is being truthful and is recounting an actual example of when they've shown that particular skill or ability, they will be able to specifically describe what went on. One of the issues with competency-based interviewing is that some candidates go to somebody like myself, an interview coach, and learn off super slick, punchy, very, very well-sounding examples of all of these different areas, and possibly invent past examples or at least spin them out and pad them out to sound exactly like the descriptor that they've been provided. And unless the interviewer is able to probe effectively, unless the interviewer is able to work effectively, you'll find that candidates can get away with that, that gloss.
So what would be a good way of getting underneath the gloss or being sure that someone's giving you a genuine answer?
Well, I think there are several things, and I was thinking about the podcast before we met, Lucinda. I think there are certain things that I would advise that interviewers would do prior to the interview. And I know it's corny to say preparation, but I think there are certain things that anybody who's been asked to sit on a panel are conscious of before they start. And I think it is something to be really conscious of. At the end of the day, you are representing your organisation. The whole point of an interview being a two-way process is that you're the face of that particular department or that particular organisation. I think the whole preparation and taking this really seriously is important. And then if you like, I can move on and talk about some of the things that would be useful in terms of the digging and the probing during the interview. And I'd love to just have time to finish off with a few tips and ideas for after the interview.
That sounds great. So we can you've got a little structure that you can run through.
Yeah, if that's okay with you.
Of course. I've really led the way. I feel like I'm being interviewed. I'm being taken on a journey. Clearly an expert.
Oh, jeepers. So yeah, let's go back to that point. And so before the interview, the whole preparation point, as I say, I think it's really important that especially if you are the one who's leading, if you are the one that's welcoming the candidate in, I think it's important just to check in with yourself that you are, you're engaged, you're enthusiastic, perhaps share a little bit about your position and the fact you've worked here for a certain time and that one of the things you love about the organisation is. And I'm just also then perhaps build up the fact that the role that that you are interviewing for is a really important role. So I think that whole first impression things, I'm often talking to my candidates about the importance of first impressions, but I have so many people tell me they're walking in, the interviewers are not looking up, they're scrabbling through their notes, some of them are finishing writing notes from the last candidate, and it's just a little bit all over the shop. And perhaps I just think that whole professionalism and first impressions goes both ways. I think that's what my point is.
Do you know, it really does. And I think on that point, it's getting increasingly important. The whole area now is you want to have the best talent. And actually, it may have been a point once when it was a buyer's market, but actually now it's becoming more of a seller's market. So first impression is really important.
Absolutely. That first impression. And that then continues on, of course. I've heard all sorts of stories about people realizing that there's politics being played out, maybe between two of the managers who are sat on the panel, or somebody who's completely overbearing and spends most of the interview talking themselves. I just think you need to be aware of the impression that you're giving to the other side of the table.
Those might be quite difficult. I'm just thinking that might be quite difficult to deal with if you're a junior member of the panel and someone brings you in and they're talking through it, you'd perhaps have to deal with that offline, wouldn't you? Unless you've got any tips on managing fellow panel members.
Yeah, and actually I can pick up on that at the end, because I do think the whole review of the whole process is something that is often missed. People run away and they don't actually then look at how things work. So we can
reflect on themselves.
Yeah.
Actually, okay, that sounds like a good idea.
And then just moving on to some of the other things that I think are really important around that preparation. It's unbelievable how many times candidates will have told me that panel members are literally reading their CV or reading the application. And then just, let's say, lingering a little bit longer on preparation, Lucinda, I do think, and I've heard all sorts of stories from different candidates about panel members who are reading the CV or flicking through the application form while they're actually in their interview. I do think it's so important. And it's about showing dignity and respect, I think, for the amount of time that candidates have put into it. It's good manners. So please do read the CV and the application form and make a few notes prior to going to the interview. Ensure that you have an accurate job description, and that if you're not the hiring manager, that you have an understanding of the competency descriptors, and possibly, and it should be done in a pre-meeting, that you have had input from the hiring manager about what particularly they're looking for, or what is it that the success would look like. There is a great question which I ask my candidates to ask, if possible, to the hiring manager prior to an interview, which is this. If I could ask you to imagine we're 12 months down the line and you're reviewing my first year in post, could I ask you, what have I delivered that would exceed expectations of me? Now, I think that's a really powerful question to ask somebody.
I bet that's what the interviewers say, because they've no idea how to answer it.
Well, it's funnily enough, the number of times people have said to me that the first response they get is, oh my God, that's a great question. Just give me a moment. And then they have a pause, a lingering pause, and they maybe come up with a couple of ideas about what would delight them, what would exceed their expectations. Well, that's gold dust if you're ever going for an interview. But I think it's a really valid question for interviewers, and certainly the hiring manager, to share with their fellow panel members, because you're really focusing down and tailoring what can be it's like a tsunami of information is going to come across the table to you, with all these various people going past on the conveyor belt. That really focuses everybody on the panel to what exactly does good look like, and what is it specifically the hiring manager is wanting in that.
What I like about that, Jo, I think, is also the fact that we've talked about competency-based interviewing. I haven't researched this recently, and they think that it's actually past performance is a predictor of future performance. Yet, if you see that on a share certificate, they would say they wouldn't guarantee that past performance isn't going to guarantee future performance. So what you're also doing is almost future pacing it, so that everyone's thinking you're giving people a fair chance, because there might be some people who they haven't had the opportunity to evidence every single competency or bit of experience, but they've got the potential to.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, actually, because I know of several large organizations who actually recruit people who are able to perform at 85% of the level needed. So rather than recruiting somebody in who can do the job with their eyes half closed, they recruit people who are 85 or maybe 90% there, so that there is room for them to grow. They feel they're going to be more motivated and they'll grow into the role. And I think that's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, definitely.
And so then once you've, as I say, if you have a question plan, my top tip really, and this is also, I'm not an employee law expert or anything in terms of legislation, but I do think if you have a question plan and you've derived that purely from the job description and the competencies, the descriptors of the competencies, then you're far more likely to stay on the right side of the line. As in, you're not going to be asking anything irrelevant or not related to the job. I would always have a question plan. And if you are very new to interviewing, this is where you might go to a HR professional to ask, could you just check that this is going to be in line with company policies and within employment legislation? I think that's important.
Do you recommend, I remember once going to an interview, I've been recommended to use a model called STAR, situation, task, action, result, or where you could either tell the candidate that that's how you are interviewing them, or request back from them. Or are there any models that you recommend?
Well, STAR is the most universally used one. Yeah. So you have your situation, you have your task, then your actions. And I'd always suggest that people bullet point those actions as an interviewee, because it keeps you and it keeps the panel on track from finishing with your result. And interesting, you mentioned future pacing, Lucinda. That would be something I think a lot of people don't do, is that once you finish your example, you've described your situation and what you did, you then go on and say, why is this beneficial? Why would this relate to the role? Or why does this make you able to do the job you're going for? So I do think STAR would be the most certainly well-used model within the competency-based method.
And would you encourage the interviewers to tell them that's what you're going to ask? Or would you say, please, so what exactly did you do? How would you tell an interviewer to?
Well, it tends to be outlined, certainly over here in Ireland, and a lot of the candidates that I would be coaching, that would be part of the way the application form is laid out nowadays. It has become quite structured. And some people would argue a little bit overly rigid. And I do think, again, that comes down to the skill of the interviewer, that it doesn't just seem like a conveyor belt of a process, that there's still some personality involved.
Yeah.
That it's a little bit softer. But literally, I've had people go in, they're not even asked a warm-up question. It's literally, we're starting with the first competency, planning and organising. Can you give me an example of? And it just becomes very, very rigid.
Is there room for personality, for that gut feel or any of that into an interview? If you came down to it, if you were being really, really objective, it's almost, we could do it through AI, wouldn't we? But there's this human gut feel, although I'm sure it's probably been proven to be inaccurate gut feel. But anyway.
Yeah, I think as I say, the thinking behind competency-based interviewing, it's meant to be, in inverted commas, fairer. And it's meant to ensure that people provide the evidence or they don't provide the evidence. And actually, it's one of the things I'm going to mention about in terms of tips or good practice while you're actually running an interview, is that your previous knowledge of a candidate must not or should not be used if you are somebody who's internally interviewing somebody that you have prior knowledge of. And I think that's where the HR professional, and often the chair, they do have a key part to play to ensure that evidence is not, it's only the evidence rather that's
produced by the candidate
that is scored. And that removes this bias, be that conscious or unconscious bias that people will have. There's nothing that's perfect. Competency-based interviewing isn't a perfect process. I don't think there is, but it is meant to be more accurate and more equitable. Yeah. One little tiny thing, just one tiny little tip, actually. This was something that somebody mentioned to me, which I thought was a great idea. I'd say, hopefully you've got your interview panels lined up. You've got your people prepped. You've shared the competencies. You've maybe highlighted what you would like specifically. Just one last thing. I just wish an interviewer, one of the four on the panel, actually just before the first candidate comes into the room, takes a seat in the chair that will be sat in by the candidates.
Oh, put themselves in their shoes, just feel it.
Exactly. But just get into that other chair. I've had people tell me that where they've been sat under an air conditioning vent that has blown literally freezing cold air down their neck all the way through their interview. Or I've had a couple of candidates tell me that they were sat so close to the interviewers they practically have their knees touching. Or the sun is glaring through the window. And obviously the interviewers hadn't even noticed because they're sat with their back to it. So I just think it's a tiny point, but it actually just makes sure that you second position, you put yourself in the shoe.
It's a massive human point, isn't it? To give people the chance to do their best. Yeah. And if you're an interviewee, having the guts to say that something's in my eyes, could it be okay to move it? You coach people for, but it depends how nervous you are.
Absolutely. You want to get you're wanting to get the best out of the candidate. You really are wanting to put them at ease. They're likely to, as I say, give a far better interview if you just give them the opportunity to do so. I think that's my point.
Yeah, fair point.
Okay. So like you say, moving me on, and I do think it's right. Let's move on and just talk about my sort of top tips, if you like, for during the interview. We really are wanting to assure, as I say, that people are at ease. And I think the opening question is critical. I don't know what you've heard used or whether you can reflect on it you've had, but I've heard
long time since I've had an interview.
No, I've heard some awful ones, really.
Go on, give us a few juicy awful ones just to warm us up, if you've got any top of your tongue.
Well, just people have told me that they've had questions such as, I've noticed on your CV that you did a master's in 19 something and something. Could you tell me a bit about the detail of that thesis? A complete... So they are, I guess, wanting to show that they've read the paperwork, but it completely throws a candidate who,
it's not really relevant. I tell you what, quite often I remember being asked is they'd go, oh, can you talk me through your CV? Which you're never quite sure how long or short to make that, really, because Yeah, I always think what's your opinion on that as a question?
No, I'm really pleased you said that one, because that's the classic. Talk me through your CV, or even more. Let's say, tell me about yourself.
Oh, God.
Gosh, where do you start?
Exactly.
And I have had candidates tell me, literally, they spent 6-7 minutes going from primary school forward without, well, first of all, the panel are half asleep. Secondly, they can read, so you can see from their CV exactly where they've been. And you're not really selling or promoting yourself. So I just don't think that's giving the candidate a fair chance to begin the interview in a confident, assertive way and let you set their stall up, if you like. So I think my choice, it is. It's lazy. It is warm up. I know it's warm up. They don't always often officially mark that opening question, although it might come into the overall communication skills mark. But I think the best I would be promoting would be, or advocating would be, obviously welcome them, explain the process, but then say, briefly, could you take us through your experience or career, perhaps highlighting 2 or 3 things that you believe are particularly relevant to this role? So you're just helping them focus down on a couple of pieces of their experience or a couple of attributes that they could bring to the job. So that would be my opener.
Yeah, okay, I like that.
And then this big challenge of probing effectively. So I'd like people to sort of think that they're detectives. I mentioned one of the big drawbacks of competency-based interviewing is that you have these super prepared, super slick candidates who have practiced and recorded themselves, and they're absolutely spot on with their lovely little examples against all the competencies. And you have to be able to, number one, dig deeper. You've got to be able to challenge any generalizations they're using, and you really need to be gathering specific evidence. If the candidate is giving a truthful, actual example that they were involved in, they shouldn't have difficulty recalling the specifics or the details. It's very, very easy to unpick or uncover somebody that's blagging it, as I would say.
Give us an example of generalizations that people might come across in an interview.
Well, they would just be, and everybody thought it was a great project. And this result was really significant for the team. You'd be straight in with, that sounds fantastic. Tell me, how did you judge the significance of that? Or what evidence did you have to know that everybody was on board with your idea?
And what was your role in the decision making, or everybody, what did you do within it? Because I have had people, they'll talk about something as if it was theirs when actually they were just a supporting member. So it's finding out what their role is quite key, isn't it?
It is. And actually the opposite of that, you'll often find that people, as I joke, do a lot of weing. They talk about, we did this and we did that, and we then did such and such. And in fact, they're not selling the team. They shouldn't be, but they find maybe with nerves or lack of awareness, they start talking about the team and selling their team, and they don't talk specifically about what they did. So you get two. You get some people bigging it up and some people underselling.
And that's perhaps an indication of actually being a team player, because quite often we'd say we to be modest. And if you can drill and say, well, actually, I did that and I did that, that allows you to see where they're coming from, and the fact that they're not overplaying it, I suppose, that might be a positive attribute.
I just think maybe it's a cultural thing. We're not great at selling ourselves. We do underplay our part or our involvement. And an interview is a selling opportunity. It is a sales process. You do really need to be able to highlight what you bring to the team. And I remember only a few weeks ago, somebody was telling me about an audit that they've been involved in. He was saying that, we gathered the data, we went to so-and-so, we did this analysis, we compared it. And I said, that's interesting. Tell me, how many people were part of that audit team? And he said, oh, no, it was only me. So there wasn't even a team, but he was selling it. Yeah. So I think you get a bit of both. You get some people trying to big it up, and most people I find with nerves are underplaying their involvement. So now the key thing with the probing, and I think this is a real issue, I feel that interviewers often feel that they're being unkind or impolite to interrupt, especially if somebody is on a flow, that they are nervous about sticking in appropriate probing question. And there are 2 things that I would do, or I would suggest to help with that. The first one is warn the candidate prior that you will interrupt and probe to be able to find out more, but put a real positive spin on it. So, for example, you might say, well, I'm going to be taking the first competency, which is teamwork, and I'll be asking you for a specific example. Now, during your recount of your example, I will occasionally jump in and ask a couple of clarifying questions. Don't be put off. It's purely if I want to find out a little bit more information and give you the best opportunity to describe your skills and your attributes.
Nice.
So I would always warn the candidate, because often the candidate will be thinking, oh gosh, am I rubbish? They've just interrupted me again. I must be terrible. Or if I feel that you're going off on the point, I might just guide you gently back with a probing question. I just think that whole reframe really helps the candidate and their nerves. And then the second tip about using probing questions is do it early. So if you allow somebody to get near the end of their actions or to their result, and you haven't got in there with a probing question, I just don't think it's as effective as you jumping in early. So as I'm setting up my star by describing my situation, come in with one of the where, the when, or the who open questions. Oh, that's interesting. Tell me, when was the project? Or tell me who was involved in the project? Or where specifically within the business was that unit that you're working on? So come in early in the star. I just think people are more accepting then of your appropriate probing as you go through that.
Are you saying it sort of builds trust because you're asking it early? So even though you're not really needing to clarify at that stage, you're saying just to set the expectation that you might chip in and it's not uncomfortable. Make it more of a conversation rather than a question and a...
Yeah. And it doesn't seem so much of a Spanish Inquisition, or, it does take a little bit of that rigidity or structure out of it. But I'd say it may be that you do want the answer. It may be that you don't, but it's still useful. It's got to have a purpose to it. But you just come in and early on, people will expect you then to interrupt later. And I guess that leads me to my next one. So the open questions is obviously what we're using. We all know the difference between closed questions, open questions. But the type of open question that you use within that, they talk about the funnel. So you have a funneling technique to take somebody through a star. So if you can imagine a funnel with the S, the T, the A, and the R as you're going down, you'd use your open questions where, when, and who near the top of the star. And then you're moving into the what, the how, and the why as you go down near the bottom.
Yep.
Now, you probably found yourself, Lucinda, that there is different impact of different questions. I have to say, over the 20 odd years I've been training, I found why the least useful of the open questions.
It's the most dangerous.
Yeah, I find people get a little bit defensive, or it's just that little bit extra challenging. So if you were in an interview with me and you might be saying, this was a particularly challenging project, if I go in and say why, I just think it's that little bit more direct to me saying, what made it challenging? When was it challenging? How was it challenging?
Yeah.
In what way was it challenging? And I've found that when I've been running role plays within my interviewer training course, a lot of people use a lot of why, and they've never had the awareness that they do it.
Really? Yeah.
That might be the kind of thing you're asking your fellow panel members as part of the reflecting.
Why did you use that question?
Yeah. Why on earth did you use that question? But one of these things, it is something that people are really, really unconscious of.
Yeah. Good tip.
Yeah. So follow your plan. Treat every candidate fairly. You mustn't be leading candidates. Again, we mentioned earlier, if people are using a lot of we, talking a lot of team, just ensure that you ask them specifically what they did, because that's what we should be interviewing for.
Great. No, those are really good tips. Have you any more tips? I was going to say, I've got my notes here. I wanted to hear from you about how, one thing that's coming through, I was thinking just when you were speaking then, is that a lot of this is coming from experience. That actually it makes sense that if you were interviewing on a regular basis, you think how to introduce yourself, how to position questions, you do a better job of it. But the reality is that lots of people just come in from nowhere and have to do it, and they don't have this. So if we wrapped all these in, and then when you're about to go and be an interviewer, you have all these tips to hand. But of course, also there's a process where you reflect on it. And I know you said you were going to talk a bit about how you could top and tail the process effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. But, the interesting thing, just when you said that to me, Lucinda, is, and I said this yesterday when I ran the course, a lot of the skills we're talking about here in terms of, say, for example, using effective open questions, and as I've added on there, trying to avoid the why, these are skills that are going to be beneficial in all areas of work and actually out of work.
Absolutely.
So,
yes, good communication skills.
One final point I was going to add on, and I do think this is to always try to think myself, what are the nuggets? What are the real golden nuggets about all the training that I've run over the years? One of them is absolutely the use of reflections. I personally think if you can get into the habit of using reflective listening frequently, both at home, at work, it just is something that then you're using without even having to engage brain when you're in an interview. And when you're interviewing somebody, the use of reflections, I think, is so beneficial. Let me explain. So you might, going back to the example, you might be saying about this was a really challenging process. I think it's perfectly adequate, perfectly fine to come in with an open question. But actually, to make the candidate feel more at ease. And I actually find they give more information if you use a reflection. So you just literally reflect back the word challenging.
Like empathic listening.
I find that people then go on and give more. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So all of those skills are as relevant in an interview as they are anywhere else in business or anywhere else at home. And if HR professionals are listening and they're involved in coaching, it would be a technique that would be beneficial across the board. You don't necessarily have to have a whole brand new set of skills to be a good interviewer. It's just engaging these great communication skills.
It's like if someone's really, it's like empathic listening that Covey talks about in the 7 Habits. Is the whole thing sometimes just picking on that emotion, but with a question mark at the end of it. So you're not, the difference of what you're doing there is much more suitable in an interview because you're stating the actual word that they've stated. Whereas if you're in an emotional situation, you might sort of infer emotion from something there, which is probably not appropriate for interviewing skills. And
it can be useful to de-escalate emotion, can't it? But I think in an interview, the way that I ask people to use it within an interview situation is that if you, let's put ourselves back in that chair. Let's put ourselves in the chair of the candidate again. You're wanting to feel that the panel are actually listening to you, number one.
Yeah.
And you want to feel that you're making sense and that you're doing a good job, because that's going to allow you to do a better interview. So the way I use the reflections is actually I would cushion a question with a reflection. So you're talking away about your example of where you have shown the ability to manage a project. And I would use that reflection. That sounds like that was a very complex situation, Lucinda, with a lot of people involved. Could you tell me how you went about engaging the stakeholders and the community?
Yeah.
So I just give a little summary reflection, really. It doesn't have to be a key word like we had challenging. It could just be a little summary reflection of what the candidates just said, and then use that to lead into an open question. Rather than me just saying, how did you involve the stakeholders? I would just reflect first. It sounds like a very complicated situation. How did you go about involving the stakeholders? I mean, people tell me how there are definite interviewers that make you feel like you're making sense and you're doing a good job.
And that's all you want.
without leading and saying that that's a great answer. You can still show respect and reflectively listen.
Even if you don't get the job, you feel better if someone's doing that. What it occurs to me, of course, it's quite hard to properly listen and ask those questions and make notes. When people are trying to scribble furiously.
I am so happy you said that. I'm so happy you said that, because
you didn't even cue me up. That was a genuine question.
I know. But actually, one of the things I had meant to say earlier in the preparation, people will be familiar with the fact that you normally would have, say, 3 on a panel. That seems to be the norm, really. And you would have, ideally, really clear roles and responsibilities. So somebody would be asking the questions on a particular competency. Somebody else should be note-taking. You should definitely not be writing notes while you're doing the questioning. And then ideally, the third person should be observing. Okay, and that observation is really key. I've had a lot of candidates tell me you'll have one person doing a question and 1 or 2 people writing notes. Or even worse, one person asking the question, one person writing the notes, and the other person furiously reading the CV or the application form because they're doing the next one and they haven't done their prep.
Yeah.
And it's really off-putting when they're flicking through the paperwork when you're trying to engage the panel. So, a questioner, a note taker, separate, and then an observer, separate. So that's a useful thing. And just on that point, I think it's interesting the number of interviewers that will tell me how some panels are open to the fact that you can chip in, maybe as the observer, with a really useful probing question. And some interviewers are very, very precious about the fact, no, I'm taking teamwork. And if you dare jump in across me, all hell will break loose. So I think that's something important just to clarify up front. Are we allowed to jump in, or are we just sticking strictly to our own competency?
Well, that's like doing something with another trainer, isn't it? Whether they're comfortable you chipping in or not. And a lot of it comes down to confidence, I would say, on that person in question, or, how established the relationship is between the panel.
Absolutely. And if you can interview on a panel and do that with similar people, you do get so much from that whole reflection piece. But just again, remember, let's put ourselves back in the chair of the interviewee. How does it look when there's this sort of game playing going on from the other side of the table? So that's why it's important just to agree up front. Am I happy to or not happy for you to jump in with something that's relevant? That's all. It's just a tiny point.
Oh, you've set me off on a tangent now. Just thinking about rapport. So I would be allowed to chip in to someone who I've got rapport with, but I wonder then if we'd all have the same view of a candidate because we're so friendly. So obviously we wouldn't, because we'd be using objective examples from the competency.
That's it. Yeah, and prior knowledge or previous knowledge should not be taken into account.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we must wrap up, I guess. So afterwards, I've got just three top tips for afterwards. So number one is leave enough time. Oh my goodness, the number of times interviewers, managers will tell me that the interview overran, it never goes to time, and we were rushing through the scoring and then everyone ran away. It is a really, really important thing to have enough time, not only for the scoring of the candidates, but also for the discussion, particularly if there's a big disparity between the scores. So, after all the hard work and the whole day that's been put in, it's just important that you leave enough time.
How much time should you leave to discuss it? And should it be between the candidates?
Between the candidates, as in...
So I'm just thinking logically, I think you should have the discussion. You don't want to run over. You should have the discussion before the next candidate comes in. Otherwise, everything's drifted into one, I would have thought, and you get the recency effect. So how long do you think you need after you finish an interview to...
I think it all depends actually on A, the number of candidates, and B, how long each of the interviews themselves are. So the best practice, Lucinda, which moves to my second point, is that you individually as a panel member would score the candidate against the descriptor of the competency alone. You would do that scoring yourself prior to even anyone discussing how well they did.
Yeah. So you want some private time first to capture. So if you are interviewing back to back, the least you need is time to go and do your own evaluation on your paperwork before you do the discussion later.
Yeah. So in between candidates, you need to leave adequate time for everyone to individually score the candidate. Now, then ideally, you don't then start looking at those scores till, well, not necessarily the end of the day. If you've 10, I've heard people who are interviewing 10 or 12 candidates in a day, which is ridiculous, but I know that might be the case for some organizations. But you're not discussing each candidate after each candidate necessarily. It might be that you take a break before the lunch or after the break that you would look at the scores. Some people would leave all of the comparison of the scores to the end of the day. Because the whole thing with the competency-based interviewing is you are comparing candidates against the descriptors of the competencies. You're not comparing candidates against candidates.
Yes, that's critical.
So you're not saying she's better. Wasn't she better than that one before coffee? Yeah. Or jeepers, she was so much stronger, wasn't she, than her? So it does become quite a sort of a numerical thing. This is my score for me. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's so difficult not to compare candidates with candidates. That's the big challenge. We're still human beings at the end of the day, however much structure they like to apply on us. But you are scoring the candidate against the competencies and you're not scoring the candidates against each other. What
would you do if you get a tie in that? If it's all mathematical in the end, what would be the natural next step there?
Well, the scoring tends to, very, very rarely would you get a tie. You're looking for repeated evidence. So this would what be happening. So let's say we've seen a candidate, I came up with a score of 50 out of 100, and you've scored that candidate 70. The idea that you don't want to be just saying, well, let's just get an average and give them 60. We would then go back to the notes. We go back to the evidence to have a look at what has led us to have such a difference in our scoring.
Okay.
We'd be looking for repetition of evidence. We'd be looking at the competency descriptor, and we'd be wanting to come to one of us rounding up or rounding down and agreeing to go with the consensus rather than just doing a quick, easy average.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
And I do think that's where the HR professional or the neutral in the room is absolutely key to ensure that there isn't internal bias going on or prior knowledge being told, as in, I know she didn't say that she did X, Y, and Z, but I know she runs projects like that all the time. That's why I gave her 70.
Bias. Yeah, absolutely.
Can't be. It's not allowed to happen.
It's a calibration almost to get role that they're doing in interviews, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. It does become a kind of a mathematical thing. So I haven't heard many times where it comes to an exact tie, but you would be going back, the answer is you go back to the evidence.
Yes, of course.
And if somebody fails one of the competencies, it's usual that they then fail the interview process.
Because you need at least a pass on all of them, basically.
You need at least a pass on all of them. Okay. So, and then the final point, just to finish off, is that whole point of reviewing. This is an important communication process. This is an important process overall for any business or organization to make the right recruitment and hiring decisions. That I think it's key that at the end of all of that, when the candidate has been selected for the job offer, that the panel reviews how well they performed. How did it go? Did we have big differences? If we did, what was the difference with those and the ones where we came in close? Or which questions do we think really got to the crux of issues, and then you personally go and self-reflect yourself. And again, it's all great to talk theory, isn't it, Lucinda? But the idea would be that any particularly useful questions that you either used yourself or you heard one of your fellow panel members using, that you keep yourself a little question log, scribble them down in your diary. It's a learnt skill, no more than presenting, no more than any of these skills, coaching skills. The more you do, the better you get. But it is about reflecting on the fact that that's something that you have responsibility to do, either not to be stale because you've just always done it one way or another, or if you're not having had a lot of experience, that you can be confident that you'll get the competency to do it well.
That's comprehensive, Jo. I'm not surprised, of course, but no, that was really comprehensive. Thank you very much. And I suppose, so just summarising, we've talked about why competency interviews are a good thing, how we can develop our competency interviewing skills, how to prepare for it. One thing that's coming through very clearly is it's not about just showing up and just looking at a CV and going with the flow. To do a good job, and we really should remember that when we reflect on it, all of us really would want to give the candidate the best possible chance. So we need to prepare questions, understand what we're looking for, make sure they're right, make sure we're aligned with our panel members, understand how to ask good quality probing questions and get into that from the start, set the expectation. I really liked that bit about setting the expectation to the candidate that we were going to ask questions so that it doesn't scare them and it doesn't put them off, and then close it, not just in terms of reviewing the candidate, but in reviewing our own performance as an interview panel or an interviewer. And that overall, you can see that is going to take longer, but it's going to be a much more effective, good quality process and fairer.
Yeah, no, at the end of the day, as you said, it's not just the cost of actually pulling managers off to sit on panels or setting up to run a selection of interviews. It's the cost to the organisation of it not being the right decision in terms of who they hire, that it just makes sense for people to take it. I'd say take it seriously, but also to have confidence that you can get better and better at effective interviewing. And that will stand you in all, however far or high you go. Do you know what I mean? It's just something that's useful. And of course, useful outside of the interview room itself. All the skills are completely transferable to other areas of work.
Totally. Or personal life, in terms of if you want to people, catch up with long lost friends. No, that's great. So thanks so much, Jo. I guess we try to keep our conversations quite focused. So that's been brilliant and really succinct. What I'll do is I'll put in the show notes some links to your website and any social media links. So if people want to connect with you or otherwise, then they can find you, if that's all right.
Great. Thanks very much, Lucinda. It's been great fun. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for your time, Jo. Okay, so thanks everybody. I hope you really enjoyed this episode of the HR Uprising, found it highly informative. I certainly did. And remember, this is something, hopefully, we thought this episode might be of use to people who are outside of HR. So if you've got a manager joining you to support in interviewing, perhaps it's something that could be more widely used around your organisation. As ever, please do keep the feedback coming on the sort of topics that you'd like to hear about. And I really welcome connections on social media and any other feedback that you want to give us. Many thanks for your time. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the HR Uprising. I'm your host, Lucinda Carney. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast. You can access more information, including resources or links mentioned in the show, at our website, www.hruprising.com. Also, you might want to join our LinkedIn community or tweet to us at HR Uprising. We'd love to hear from you.